everyone! In this video I'm going to introduce you to my domestic sewing machine and how to do the basic seams with the domestic sewing machine. So I personally use the industrial sewing machine, but for this video I actually digged out my first ever sewing machine in 2010 and I'm going to show you how to operate that. So this is my good old sewing machine. This model has lots of setups. And as you can see, this is a decor one, so actually you can change many seams on this one. We can even do some basic embroideries. The bobbin holder is located laying flat just at front of the feet. The thread goes at the top, and since I have lost the closure for the thread holder, I'm using another bobbin to secure the thread and to make sure it stays on its place. Now we are going to thread our bobbin. On domestic sewing machines, you're usually going to see the instructions on the machine itself, so just make sure you follow that. You need to secure the thread on the bobbin before you start spinning. On the drawing, you will also see that from which direction you should start spinning the thread onto the bobbin, which is important to make sure the threading will go smoothly. Let's get all the excessive thread onto the bobbin before placing it onto the threading tool. Push back the bobbin until you hear a click. And now you are in the bobbin threading mode. You can safely push down on the pedal and start threading the bobbin until it stops. Ideally, your bobbin jumps back to its starting place, but mine needs some help to do that. Now we place the bobbin into the bobbin holder, which again should have the instructions shown on your machine, and you need to follow that. It's really important to place your thread inside correctly and pushing your thread to the reversing direction, just the side of it here, and make sure the thread stays inside under the feet. Finally, we thread the machine following the numbers and or drawings on our machine. All machines are a bit different looking, but they usually go the same way as I do it here. Just watch carefully and implement it to your own machine. If there are holes, make sure you put your thread into those holes and move it down to your needles. It should have a hook just in front of the needle where you need to put the thread in. This is to make sure that the thread leads into the sewing needle. We drive the thread into the needle from the front towards the back. You need to lift the feet and lead the thread underneath and pull it behind it. Let's close the bobbin holder. And I only just realized that I actually have the instructions on it to how to thread the bobbin. So you need to check your machine because I'm sure you have it as well. This is why domestic machines are actually better, because they give you all the instructions that you need. And now we are actually ready to start sewing. I did prepare a few swatches. I am using a Duchess satin fabric now, but you can use any thick dense fabric you have. First we are just going to make a simple seam. You need to lift the feet and then place the fabric underneath. Your machine might show seam allowances which you can follow while sewing. Sewing alongside these measurements is always easier. It's advised to watch the edge of the fabric rather than the needle, as if the edges are straight, your sewing line will be straight as well. I do have a long list of seams on my machine, but I'm only planning to use the simple stitch and the zigzag one, as these should be found on all modern domestic machines. On my machine, I need to choose the number of the stitch type and I have to push it on my setup buttons. And magically my sewing machine is going to do that seam, what I've just chosen. I can also set up how widely and densely I want that seam to be. If you have a similar machine to this one, I suggest you to play around with it and experience it for yourself and just see what your machine can actually do. I'm just going to stick with a normal seam now and just using its normal setup. Let's not go crazy now. My stitch distance is usually 2.4, 2.5, 2.6. This is a good one to start with. Now let's place the fabric underneath the feet. When we start sewing, we want to secure the stitch both at the beginning and at the end of the stitch. Also, you might can set up the speed like I can here. I am going to leave it on the fastest one, as the domestic machine is already really slow for me. But you feel free to use the slow setup. We are just starting out after all. So now you should have a reverse button like I have here. And this is the button that you need to keep pushing while making a reverse seam. Just let it go once you secure your seam. Try to keep a straight line by adjusting your fabric to the side of the feet or the measurements next to your feet. Don't forget to secure your seam at the end. And voila, we should have our first seam line. This is how it should look, an equal distance from the edges. This might take some time to practice, so don't be alarmed if yours not looking like this. It's completely fine, we are going to make more lines like this. Just keep practicing and make as many lines as you need to feel confident with your seam line. So probably make a series of straight seam lines and you will see it will get better and better with each and every single lines. So don't be discouraged, just keep on going. As I said before, try not to focus on the needles, but focus on the edges of the fabric or the seam line which is next to it. And make sure you keep sewing alongside that. This way you can keep an equal distance between your seam lines. At first this might seem a bit hard and confusing, but you will get the hang of it. You can also adjust your previous line to the edge of your feet. And this is also an amazing way to make sure that you make a straight line. And by now we should have more lines like these ones. If you feel like you need more practicing, just keep going. But now we are going to do some changes and we are going to adjust the setup. By adjusting the stitch distance, we can have more frequent stitches or wider ones. The wider ones are used for gathering. Feel free to have a look on all of them and just see how they look. So maybe do a wide stitch line. But don't forget to close the edges because the wider the stitch line is, it's easier to gather it. And this time we don't want to gather it yet. We are just checking out the differences between the seams. As you can see it here, this new one is a bit wider. Not much, just slightly. Let's check a small stitch one now. And it will be easy to see the difference between them. So now we are on the smallest one. So this time around the stitches will be really close to each other. Let's do that line and see all these stitches next to each other. I personally like using this kind of stitching on patchworks because it prevents the shredding of the edges of the fabric a bit more than just the general 2.5 stitch distance line. Alright, we are done with this line. Let's check it out, take it out of the machine. And voila! You can see how dense the stitching is on this one compared to the other ones. This one is actually not good on soft fabrics. I personally don't use this that much. But now we are going to change the setup and we're going to do a gathering one. For gathering I go for the widest one. So you're going to see the widest stitch line next to the most dense one. Oh, how fast I can sew like this! The wider the stitch line, the faster you actually sew. Now this is going to be exciting to see all these lines next to each other. I think you can see clearly the difference between the stitches. This last one, we usually use these for the gathering. So I suggest you to practice all these lines before we move on to the next one. Make sure you're confident with all of these. And now let's do a gathering. It is going to be a simple straight line just as we did it before. Make sure you secure the start line. Otherwise, when you start gathering, you're going to remove the whole thread and you will be left with an empty fabric. But the important part is when you get at the end, you don't do this reverse stitching. Just remove the fabric. If you do the reverse stitching at the end, you won't be able to gather the fabric. So you leave that open, like I did it here. And to create a nice gathering, I'm going to grab the thread which came from the bobbin. So this was the thread underneath the fabric and pull it. Just pull that bottom thread and you will see that the fabric is gathering. It's nice and gathered and you can adjust it. You can gather it back and forth and arrange it as you wish. It's very easy and simple. You can also just simply undo the whole gathering, just like this. Voila! We are back to having a normal seam. And now we are going to do a zigzag seam, which is actually really good for stretchy fabrics. For me it's easy to set it up. I just push the button and there it is. My machine is ready for a zigzag seam. With the zigzag seam I usually don't do this reverse stitching because this stitch is not that easy to be removed as a simple straight line stitch one. So when you want to sew an elasticated fabric, by using the zigzag seam, it is going to give it room to actually spread out and stretch out. To be honest, this is the only thing I'm using my domestic machine for. Not to mention, I do think this zigzag seam looks really nice. Look, it's so cute, really decorative. And with this zigzag line, it's going to give stretch to the fabric. So this is actually a really useful little stitch that we are probably going to use in the future. And it also has a second version, which is not just going to make a zigzag line, but it's also going to make a straight stitching line as well. So it is two different seam types combined into one. I used to use this seam to actually finish the edges of the fabrics before I had my overlocking machine. It's not as efficient as an overlocking machine, but I think it still do the trick. So I did use this stitching time for the edges of seams. And simultaneously, it didn't just close the edges, it also stitched the two fabric layers together. But now I do have this overlocking machine, which is really old, but it was a free gift, so I can't complain. Let's get back to this one. To be perfectly honest, other than that, I did not use this stitching for anything else. But feel free to experiment with it and see what you can use it for with your own projects. Because this is also a very decorative one. Could be a really nice decor stitch as well. And see, when I open my fabrics, you can see it's actually stitched together perfectly. So it does the work very well. If you have this option, try it out and see what you think about it. And now we are going to learn to make a front seam. You are going to need two pieces of fabrics. And for this one, you actually need to make sure that the wrong sides of the fabrics are facing each other. So you will see the right side of the fabric facing you and the bottom of the machine. And this is how you are going to have to do your first stitch line, because we are going to have to for this kind of seam type. So let's just do one line of stitching, facing the wrong sides of the fabrics together in the inside, and follow the line of the feet. Make sure it's a nice and clean line. Secure it at the end, just as you did at the beginning. And after removing the fabric, you're actually going to need to trim it alongside your seam line. Try to cut that line to be around 3 millimeters. I'm going with 5 millimeters now, so I'm able to show it to you. But the smaller you can trim this line to, the nicer your seam is going to be. So just trim all these fabrics, throw it out. And now, here is the trick. Open your fabrics and turn them inside out. So this is going to be the inside seam. I am looking at the wrong side of the fabric now. And we are going to have to make a stitch here, which in this case needs to be around 7 millimeters. We need to make sure that the extra fabric we just hid between these two layers won't be visible. Our seam distance has to be wide enough to cover the fabric we have just trimmed with the scissor. This is why it is important to cut it as thin as possible. And pay extra attention to actually make a nice, neat, equal distance seam here. Reverse stitch the edge and let's check if we've done this one right. When I open the fabric, I should not see any threads peeking out. So let's see if this is going to be the case, or we have to remake the whole thing. So let's open it. And voila, we have a really nice strong seam and you actually can't see anything peeking out. We use this seam for more high quality garments, skirts, shirts, because it gives a neat finishing. We can actually replace overlocking with front seam and it will be more luxurious and pretty durable as well. And now we are going to learn to make hems. I'm going to show you two different options for fabrics hemming. This first one is easier but also more time consuming. But do this if you haven't done any hemmings yet. Place the fabric under the machine with the wrong side facing you. Fold the edge inside around 5 to 10 millimeters. Try wider if you are just starting out, as it takes some practicing. So fold the edge 5 to 10 millimeters and then stitch on top of it. And try to stitch as close to the edge as you can. The best if you are stitching around 2 millimeters from the edge, but as it will take time to do that kind of stitching, just do however you're comfortable with it now. I'm gonna do with 2-3 millimeters here. So just stitch alongside the folded line, a few millimeters away from the edge, and keep folding the fabric as I do it here. I hope you've seen it clearly. After securing the end, this is how it should look now. So you can see I did fold the fabric inside. I made a seam few millimeters away from the edge. And now we actually need to cut off this excess fabric here. Cut alongside your seam line. Try to make it as small and neat as possible. This needs to be a really thin line, as thin as you can do. Don't be discouraged if yours is not this thin. If you keep practicing, it's even going to be nicer than mine. So just don't give up. After we cut off all this extra fabric, we are actually going to have to turn this line inside, just like this. So turn it inside, and we are going to stitch on top of our first line. So fold it inside and try to stitch over our first seam line. So this might look harder than it is, but believe me, once you've got that first line, it is going to be so much easier, because you actually see the line that you have to keep sewing onto. Just try to keep as close to that line as possible. No rush, just take it slowly, and make sure you don't actually run off the fabric. Since it's a thin line, it's easy to actually run off. That's why you just keep sewing slowly as it's comfortable for you. And at the end, this is how our line should look like. So this is our first option to do hemmings on outfits. The second option for hemming is actually less time consuming but require more skills. This time we are going to fold the fabric twice and just do one stitch line. So instead of folding once, stitching, cutting, folding again and stitching again, we are just going to fold the edges twice, place it under the machine, and just do one line of seam. This takes twice less time than the other option, but it is much harder if you don't have experience with hemming. So probably first practice the first option that I just shown you, and then once you're confident with that one, you can try to do this type of hemming. I do think that the first option is actually nicer and more neat, but it takes so much more time than this one. Plus, once you learn how to do this kind of hemming, you won't see much difference between the two hem lines. So this one is about practicing, practicing, and more practicing. And now let's see both lines next to each other. So the top part is the double folded one, and the bottom one is the two stitch one. Feel free to try both and see what you prefer. Finally, at the end, we are going to do a top stitching. To do a top stitching, first just get your fabrics together, facing the right sides each other, placing it under the machine, and just make a simple seam around 1–1.5 centimeters from the edge. I personally use top stitching for corsets because usually this is how I create the tube for the bonings. But it also can be a decorative element on your design. So this is a really good basic seam to actually know. And not to mention it's quite easy. So we have the basic seam. This is the front side and this is the back side of the fabric. We open the seam line. If it helps, you can iron it here. So you can iron it open or just place it under the machine like I'm going to do it now. And usually I use the white of the feet to create a nice straight line. We are actually going to make a stitch on the seam allowance itself. So we are actually going to stitch our seam allowance back to the main fabric. You can see I am following the middle line with my feet, and this is how I keep a straight, nice line along the way. And I actually do this on both seam allowances because we open the seam allowance and we just done one side, and now we are going to do the exact same thing on the other side. So we did wide open the seam allowance and then we are stitching it back to the main fabric. We also use top stitching to give a crisp edge for corners. We use them on pockets, zippers, or just as a decor. And then we have the two top stitches on top of our folded seam allowances. Top stitching can also be used just on one side, securing two layers together. I do hope you learned a lot today because we actually did quite a few seams. And I would like you to keep practicing all of these seam types because we are going to use them in the future. So this is it for today's lesson. These are the basic seam types. These are the ones you should keep practicing, and you need to become confident using them. You need to become confident using your sewing machine, so keep practicing. And once you mastered all of these seam types, we can start sewing clothing. In my next video, I'm going to show you how to insert zippers, and we're gonna do this next time. Bye!